Hi, everyone, and good morning. I wanted to share with you some important points that I think will be beneficial for the class going forward regarding the material that we have covered so far in the class, all the way up to the chapters from weeks 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so I have some key observations from your assignments, both the discussion question responses as well as your assignment, your short paper. And first of all, I want to say that you did a great job on those, and I found them to be very intuitive and for the most part accurate. But I do have some key observations that I wanted to note regarding some of these concepts, right? And they're not easy concepts, and so sometimes we have to think them through, perhaps look at them from a different perspective, because when we think about public goods and publicly provided goods, right, we kind of might get confused, right? We might get confused sometimes into concluding which is really a public good, and and then of course analyzing the good and how you can how society or government can internalize those externalities, or how can government help um, to mitigate some of those impacts of those market failures that are being produced. Okay, so I have here a chart which I hope gives you a better idea about how to think about and how to analyze public goods versus other types of goods in the economy. Of sometimes confusing a public good versus it's a private good because you bought it, you paid for it, right? Uh, it is excludable, and it's also it reduces from the utility that you would get from consuming your pizza. So it is rival. Is a private good. Then you have goods are non-rival in consumption because 50 million Americans who got pay-per-view for that fight were able to enjoy it from somebody else watching it. But they were excludable because, again, you don't have you can watch the fight, right? The fight has to be paid, and unless you pay for the signal, you don't get access to the fight. Okay, so now non-excludable rival in consumption. And this is where it begins to get tricky, because when we think about clean water, right? Clean water, clean air, in fact, um, it is non-excludable. We cannot exclude people from consuming the water in a river, for example, using it to bathe or to drink or to water their plants. But it is rival in consumption, because the more that somebody else uses that water, the less water you're going to have for yourself. And eventually, right, clean water is rival in consumption, because we assume that the more people use clean water, the less clean water will be available to go around, right? And so common resources like clean water are rival in consumption, but they are non-excludable. So that creates a source of a market failure, which we'll talk about later. Then you have the last example, and that's the public good, and that's non-excludable and non-rival in consumption. And this is the best case example is the national defense, right? Say U.S. national defense. You cannot exclude anybody from enjoying that protection, and at the same time, the enjoyment of a citizen in Iowa and a citizen in California or a citizen in Florida is non-rivaled. Everybody can consume that protection without it affecting the utility of that protection. So national defense is a perfect example of a public good. Okay. Now, public sanitation also, right? Public sanitation is another example of a non-excludable and non-rival in consumption. Okay. All right. So those are the four different types of goods that we normally find in the economy. Okay. There are other types of goods, sometimes referred to as club goods, and we might address those here in the next slide. By the way, going back to the previous slide, notice that I have here that laws of supply and demand are the same for both private and public goods. Okay, so the law of supply and demand doesn't change whether a good is private or public, right? The problem is that with public goods or with common resource goods or club goods, we have a difficult time pricing. That's the problem. Because if we had a price for the good, we could arrive at an efficient allocation of that good, right? Supply and demand. But the problem is for public goods and for some publicly provided goods or common goods is that we sometimes are unable to price. And so we don't know, the law of demand and the law of supply become impossible to determine. So if we can determine them, those goods move in the same direction, right? If the price of a good goes up, then we tend to consume less of it. If the price of a good goes down, we tend to consume more of it, right? In fact, think about if you're using a road that is free, right? So that price is zero. Well, the incentive there is to consume infinite amounts of that road. If you all of a sudden close that road and charge a price of $5 per use, well, you'll see the quantity demanded go down considerably. So with public goods, it's all about the source of the market failure. And I think this is sometimes where we get confused in that, not that you're necessarily wrong to say that certain things are a market failure, but it's important to understand where the market failure is coming from. Because, for example, we have different sources of market failure, like asymmetric information. So asymmetric information does not allow the market to clearly assign risk. For example, the healthcare system, right? Or the market for used cars, right? The fact that the user, the owner of the car, knows more than the buyer, the potential buyer of the car, is a source for a market failure because of the asymmetry of information. Maybe the buyer does not know that that car has been in the shop 25 times, or that the car had an overhaul, right? And so that asymmetry is a source of market failure, because what's going to end up happening is the transaction that will ensue from a potential sale of that car will cause the buyer to pay more than what he or she would have paid had he or she known about the real condition of the automobile. So asymmetry of information is a source of market failure. Imperfect competition is another source of market failure. And this happens with monopolies. So not to say that the monopoly itself is efficient. The monopoly might be providing a very high quality product and using the best cost effective strategies possible. The problem is that because there is no competition, perhaps the price being charged to consumers is higher than what would normally be charged if there was competition. So the lack of competition is the source of the failure, not necessarily the product itself. Then you have another source of market failure, and that's the lack of well-defined or clearly established property rights. And this is the tragedy of the commons example. Remember, the idea that when you don't have the property rights to a common resource, you end up with an overconsumption of that resource, right? And so that creates a market failure. This is the problem with, for example, with clean water, right? This is a common resource, and because we don't have clearly established property rights, people will consume more of it than is desirable, and desirable in the sense of the efficient amount of usage for that society. Incomplete markets, another source of market failure. And this has to do with the lack of prices, or the lack of information, or the misinterpretation of risk. And this is found in the healthcare market. This is found in the education market. For example, the student loans, right? Federal student loans is an example of an incomplete market, because the government does not know what kind of a risk you represent as far as an incoming student. The government doesn't know what you're going to study. So the government doesn't know if you are going to be able to pay or not. The fact that the student loans do not use the credit ratings for access and for eligibility creates an incomplete market, because essentially by law you are allowed to borrow these Title IV funds, and so it creates an incomplete market in that sense. Of course, public goods, right? The big one, right? Public goods are a source of market failure because they cannot exclude, they cannot keep somebody from consuming it, right? So we talked about defense, right? But thinking about something, for example, a road, a public road, right? A public road, even though, by the way, a public road, and some of you used this example, is not a pure public good because it is rival in consumption at some level, right? The more people use it, the more congestion, the less utility you get from the road. So it is non-excludable, but it is rival. So it is not really a public good. It's more a quasi-public good, or a more of a common resource. Okay, or in fact, in some cases it's also, if you think about a toll road, a toll road is a publicly provided a privately provided public good, in the sense that it is there for the public to use, right? But it has a price, it has a cost, and so you can exclude people. If you don't want to pay that toll, you simply don't use the public good. You don't use the road. And so you can exclude, right? But through price. You can't exclude in any other category, but you can exclude through the price mechanism. Which means then that if this private road, right, a toll road, and these are, I guess, quasi-private because, again, anybody can use them as long as they pay the toll. So, but the idea here is that if you pay the toll, even if you pay the toll, you might still find traffic, and you might still find congestion and pollution, and so all these other negative externalities that arise from a public road are still possible in a toll road. The difference is that there is a market for the toll road where you can actually internalize those externalities. And the market is simply by charging a higher toll. The higher toll, the less number of consumers are going to be willing to use that road, which will eventually give you the equilibrium quantity of cars in that road. So that's the difference between a toll road and a publicly provided road, or a public road, in that it's not the harmful negative impacts of traffic that are the market failure, but rather the inability to internalize those market failures. And then lastly, of course, externalities. And externalities are a source of market failure. But we have to differentiate between externality as the source of the market failure, or an externality as the product of another market failure. Like, for example, asymmetric information, or again, a publicly provided good, right? Like a toll road, right? Because going back to the traffic example, the congestion is the product of supply and demand. It is the result of supply and demand, okay? And you can internalize that externality simply by charging a higher toll. As far as the pollution that is caused by the cars, that's a separate issue, because the pollution is an externality, but that pollution is separate from the toll road. In other words, you're going to have that externality, that pollution, regardless of whether the car is on that road or in a public road. And so the externality, the pollution, is the inability of the market to correctly price the contamination by automobiles. And so if the market is able to price pollution, then you can internalize that externality. But the externality doesn't arise from the road itself. The externality arrives from the type of product, the automobile, which creates that pollution. The automobile could be parked in front of your house and still be emitting those harmful gases into the environment. So the externality is the actual product itself. And so how do you internalize that? Well, maybe government and society is able to arrive at an optimal amount of pollution in the environment. Say, for example, a contamination rate that will not destroy the environment, but will allow people to still drive their cars. So let's say this rate was, on a scale of 0 to 100, say 40. Well, if you can create a market where you can either tax, subsidize, or legislate to ensure that the market is only driving a number of cars up to 40, then you are being successful in internalizing that externality. But for you to be able to do that, you would have to create a market. You would have to create the mechanisms, price market mechanisms or other types of mechanisms to internalize that negative externality. Okay, so what's coming next this week? For this week, we have a few things on the docket, and the first is to read chapters 10 to 13. All right. Watch the videos on the key topics, and so you're going to have several videos there that you should watch because they are very good and intuitive. And then lastly, watch my lecture. Watch Dr. T's Week 4 lecture, okay? And then, of course, don't forget the journal assignment that is due at the end of this week, 11:59 p.m., all right? All right, so I hope you enjoy this week, and let me know if you have any questions. Please drop me a line. I'd be more than happy to explain further, and enjoy the week. God bless.